Hello, welcome back to the Law of Karma, Destiny and Choice. Today we will be looking at a subject that our speaker, Sister Denise, has touched on throughout this series, entitled Empowering One's Conscience. So, Sister Denise, it's a pleasure to have you back in the studio with us. Hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you, Magla.
The conscience, you've stated from the beginning of the series, plays a pivotal role in keeping one honest and ensuring that one's karmic record is as clean as possible. Now, most individuals have a disempowered conscience. We ignore our conscience. We're all guilty of that. How does one go about rising?
There's two problems. It's true, people disregard the voice of conscience, but with good reason, and that is because the conscience has become unreliable, and they don't know how or why it became unreliable. And the law of karma says that if you disregard the voice of conscience, it'll gradually lose functionality, and that takes place over several births.
Okay, I want to interject right there. What do you mean the conscience has become unreliable?
You want to do something, your conscience says don't, but you're not sure. So your relationship with the voice of conscience is that, okay, you'll argue with it, or maybe it doesn't even say anything, so okay, you go with what you think. Or you can't really tell whether it's your desire speaking or your conscience speaking. So this is a very unreliable internal mechanism of your intellect, because the conscience is part of the intellect. It's a device, you can say, corresponding to like an electronic device. We have artificial intelligence is copying real intelligence. So the conscience will say, this is right, this is wrong. I experience what I call disobedient tech. When you're connected to the internet, it says you're not connected. You plugged in something, it says it's not plugged in, it is plugged in. Or it says it is plugged in, it's not plugged in, So I think the electronic world has also got some problems in it that correspond in a way to the problems that are going on in consciousness. In order for you to get your conscience to function well, you have to begin a regime of listening to the voice of conscience and acting on it, because gradually it will reacquire its original functionality. When you disregard the voice of conscience, you don't know how to make a decision, you cannot perform moral reasoning, you are forced to ask the advice of somebody who may not have your best interests in mind, and who then gives you a piece of advice which is good for them but bad for you. Then you feel betrayed, and the whole thing goes from bad to worse. So this is a very important instrument to bring to a good working order. Without that, you can't really apply the law of karma.
In a previous episode, the issue of indoctrination came up.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that play out vis-a-vis the conscience?
I think it's very significant. The word indoctrination is quite a heavy word.
It is.
How does a person learn their principles of ethics and morality is from childhood, and they're told by the external moral authorities, which are their parents, their teachers, and their religious leaders, this is right, this is wrong. And they're also very often told that whatever you think is right and wrong is not reliable. So it's a setup to get people to not have faith in their conscience, because there are quite a few instances where a person, even as a child, will experience a discrepancy between what the voice of conscience says and what the moral authorities say, and they will have confusion. Normally, in child development, the conscience starts really functioning at the age of 6 or 7. And before that, it's too young, too undeveloped to really be reliable. And this is why it's also said in religious circles that once you have a child below the age of 7, you can make that child believe whatever you want them to believe, because they will take it right in. Because the conscience doesn't filter it until a little bit later. So this is why teaching these things to very young children is considered important, because you bring that culture, those mentalities and everything into the child at a very young age, and then you continue to cultivate it. But a time comes which we may want to call the age of reason.
Sorry, what? Is that a thing? Age of reason?
The age of reason is a time when it's usually teenage, maybe 13, 14.
Oh, you mean a phase in someone's life?
Yes, yes.
All right, okay.
This phase in your life where you suddenly say, I don't agree with the prevailing social attitudes because it doesn't correspond with the voice of conscience. So then there's some sort of a battle that goes on. So in some cultures, they will force a child to do something that the conscience says no. And in that way, on the one hand, they destroy the conscience, they corrupt the child, and they make that child part of that culture and accept that what the conscience says is wrong is actually right. And from then on, the voice of conscience is very much disempowered. And so what we're talking about in this episode is seeing if it's possible to repair that damage.
Okay, and you are of the view that it can be repaired?
I'm not absolutely certain, because I think there are variables to take into consideration. In something like this, I look at my own self, and the way I have led my life has always been, and I've always been called rebellious, because I have never allowed anyone to displace the voice of conscience at any price, and it's always a high price. But my conscience has always remained absolutely intact, and so I'm very grateful for that. But I've seen a lot of people, and I've observed when and how their conscience was broken and by whom. And this has been a lot of instances, so that I know that it's something, in a sense, institutionalized, because the culture has certain principles that it enforces in order to maintain its raison d'être. So, for example, if it's a patriarchal culture, there will be many things that are done to disempower women. And the voice of conscience goes against that, because conscience is part of the soul is genderless, and so the conscience doesn't have misogyny as part of its makeup, but the patriarchal culture does. And so what is right in a patriarchal culture is wrong from the angle of conscience. And if you're in a patriarchal culture and you operate on the basis of conscience and you question the misogyny, you will be punished. And it's not the law of karma that's punishing you, it's the culture. And the law of karma will say, at one point, by the way, did you know your next birth is as a woman? And, you're going to experience the other side of this problem. But people don't get it.
In another episode, you said something that is very beautiful. It's one of those things that are known, yet not known. It is a very common English expression that honesty is the best policy, and yet honesty is a virtue that has become rather rare in today's world. So how does a personal policy of honesty contribute towards refining the conscience?
The word honesty has a different meaning for different people.
Yeah.
Because when somebody says honest, what they mean is compliant.
Really?
Yes. And when they say compliant, they mean you follow the voice of the prevailing social attitudes. And if you don't, because you're listening to the voice of conscience, you can easily get labeled as dishonest. And so the word honesty has so much of a spectrum of meaning because of the distortion that happens to the word under the influence of human ideas about what's right and wrong that are in opposition to the laws of karma, that I think it's a problem to use the word honesty. I would rather say, okay, if you listen to the voice of conscience, that's one thing, or you listen to the voice of the prevailing moral authority, that is sometimes corresponds, but a lot of time doesn't correspond. So whenever it corresponds, there's no problem. When it doesn't correspond, you have a choice. Either you betray yourself, or you betray the people who you're supposed to be loyal to. So it puts you in a very awkward situation, and then you have to navigate those waters, shark infested, very carefully.
Sure. Sounds like a perilous journey.
It is.
How does one do that? You've explained the what. Now tell us how.
I think the first thing is you have to answer this question for yourself. Is it better to betray myself, or is it better to betray the people who are in power in the community where I live? And that is a very difficult question to answer, and you have to calculate what is the cost of betraying myself, and write it down, and what is the cost of betraying the people in power in my community, and decide which one is more expensive and do the other one. And it's actually more expensive to betray yourself, but sometimes you may not sit down and make the calculation. If you do make the calculation and you do find that, then it means that although it's less expensive to betray the people in power around you, you need to be more clever than them, more wealthy than them, and you need to have more internal power than them in order to survive the ensuing situation. So it's a game.
It's a game. When it comes to conscience, how does one's choice of words impact on one's conscience?
Oh, well, there you have to be very good in diplomacy.
That's not a skill everyone was born with, Sister Denise.
Well, the thing is this, if you say, I choose not to betray myself, then the law of karma will say, okay, you want to go that road, then you need to be well equipped. You need excellent weapons, because you're going into a battlefield where you're one and the others are many. So you need to tread carefully, and you need to be very skillful, because you have to interact with them in such a way that they do not consider you as someone to be taken out, because you are effectively in an adversarial relationship. Even though you may be right according to the laws of karma, but from the realities of your social situation, you're not in power, you're not in a position of power. Definitely your personal power will be greater, your application of the laws of karma will be more accurate, and yet you're in a weak position. And so I give people another question to answer, and that is it better to be a powerful soul in a weak position, or is it better to be a weak soul in a powerful position? Most people answer that question saying, oh, it's better to be a powerful soul in a weak position, because sooner or later, because you're a powerful soul, you'll get in a powerful position, but you might get assassinated on the way, in which case it won't work. And this is why you need to disguise yourself.
What? Sorry, what? What is that? Disguise yourself.
Disguise yourself means don't make it obvious that you're a powerful soul.
Hide your light under a bushel.
Maybe put a lampshade at least.
Right, disguise yourself. Sure. Hello? Never heard of that one before. Go on.
If you have a high goal and you want to fulfill your motivation of love for God and love for humanity, and you're in a spiritual practice, sometimes it is said for people on the path of spirituality that you're a spiritual warrior, which means there is a matter of an enemy. So one enemy is the force of evil, and the other enemy is the people who are loyal to the force of evil without recognizing it. Because we've used this word ignorance. So it does happen that a person who's ignorant thinks that they're very knowledgeable, but they're actually ignorant. And the force of evil is also called the force of ignorance, which means that the people who are in power, as well as ignorant, would be working on behalf of the force of evil in that sense. And if you are developing yourself spiritually and you say, okay, I'm on the side of God, but you find yourself on the other side from the people who are ignorant, and they are many, they have a lot of power, which means that if you're in a weak position in an adversarial situation, you have to move carefully and invisibly, otherwise how will you go?
I have an expression, be wise, don't advertise.
Yes. Among the Native American Indians, the scouts learn the art of invisibility. So they can go right into the enemy camp, no one will see them. They get all the necessary information, come out again, So this practice of being invisible, I think, is a bit different from keeping your light under a bushel. It's a disguise.
One has to be very wise in the way one reconnects with your own conscience and re-evaluate one's conscience. Earlier you mentioned the importance of doing a post-mortem of every day. That's not the term that you used, I'm using it. How does that help as far as your conscience is concerned?
I think it's a very good exercise because you're looking back in your day and you're evaluating what you did and why you did it, and you're checking with a fine-tooth comb whether you are acting according to your conscience 100% or maybe only 90%, because there's a percentage in that. And it's all about very, very fine calculation. And so if you do this out of interest, which is really very interesting, you become skilled, and then you really remove the gap between your espoused values and what you actually do, so that what you are is what it is.
From a spiritual perspective, is listening to one's conscience, refining it, does it mean that you raising the bar for yourself?
I think it does very much. You remember in another episode I talked about competing with God.
Yeah, I still find that so fascinating.
But this is a little bit connected with that, because the bar of God is at the highest place.
That is true.
And I think you're just trying to raise your bar so it gets a little bit closer, and you're competing with God in that sense.
Okay, so what is the return, the karmic return of raising one's own bar higher?
Well, if I can interpret that question of what is the return of really, really listening to your conscience, the return is you become a person of integrity, and you also become invincible.
I've always loved the virtue of integrity.
When you're, really, really powerful because of being a person of integrity, you exercise a huge amount of influence, and that needs to be counterbalanced with humility. And it's so easy when you go higher and higher, the possibility of ego is more and more and more. Power is toxic.
What does that mean? Power is toxic.
Power is...
What? Hold on. Hold on. What do you mean by that, and what type of power are you referring to?
Power is power. When you raise the bar in the way that we've been talking about, it means you're coming in more and more and more into a position of power, not necessarily social power or political power, but you're in your power.
Okay, so it's personal power.
Yes, but
Okay.
When you're in your personal power, it is very influential. People are afraid of it. People will do what you say without realizing why they're doing what you say. They will look at you if they say something to get your approval. This sort of thing will happen.
And why is this toxic?
Because if you're not pure, it'll turn you into a monster.
Feeling scared right now, Sister Denise. So, which way to go?
You remember I wrote a book called Sayamaki,
Yeah.
and this was really analyzing people's relationship with power, their desire for power, and how we have this expression, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But who can hold power is someone whose motivations are the purest of the pure. So I think that if you're competing with God, okay, you raise your bar to be close to God's, you might be beyond everybody else, but you're never going to get beyond God. That's not possible.
I'm sure someone with a very high conscience draws God's attention.
Well, I'm sure, because God will also know that, this person is playing with a very dangerous substance. Because you're coming into your power, that means very toxic substance around you. You have to be really, really, really pure for that.
What do you mean by purity?
Purity means your motivations have to be impeccable. Any contamination from trauma has to be removed. Any contamination from incorrect ideas has to be removed. Any being under the influence of any other person has to be removed. And this is why they say it's lonely at the top. You have to be a solitary person and just with God, And it takes lots of time and all that to reach there. And anyway, at the end of a lot of time, you become old and you die. So anyway, you want to go to God. So it kind of all goes in that direction. But from the point of view of spiritual achievement, spiritual goals and so on, I think what you want is to be free. What you want is to be pure. And what you will get in the process is you will come into your power, which means big power, and you will perform very pure karma, which means big fortune. And the dark forces will pay even more attention on you than God, because, someone's escaping. Get them,
You touched on this earlier. I'd like to go back to it. Part of raising your conscience, does it not necessarily imply that the quality of your words and the quality of your actions must match your conscience?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense that your conscience is here and your words are here and your actions are even lower.
Well, this is why the daily assessment is really helpful, because then you will see the gap. and you must close that gap.
You must close that gap.
This is the highest priority. Everything else is secondary.
Yeah. Sister Denise, you mentioned the work. What is the end result of having a conscience that is so powerful and so empowered and so high that you draw God's attention? What is the gain? What is the prize?
I think the prize is complete purity. And if you have complete purity, you're absolutely close to God. And there isn't anything better.
Wow. On that exquisite note, I bid you farewell and many blessings. So there you go, empowering the voice of the conscience. I don't want to say too much. I want to leave you with Sister Denise's last words, which I hope embeds itself in your heart and mind forever. Take care. Goodbye.